As the last of the British and French troops were saved from the beaches of Dunkirk in June 1940, the future looked bleak for the Allies after the early skirmishes of the Second World War. Soon afterwards, Hitler and his Nazi stormtroopers had marched into Paris as France fell, and for the German Führer, the United Kingdom, only separated from continental Europe by the English Channel, became his next target. Nevertheless, despite the defeat at Dunkirk, the miraculous rescue of so many Allied servicemen had proved that Hitler was not quite as invincible as to date he'd always seemed. And when the battle for Britain began, a German victory was far from being a foregone conclusion, despite the superiority of Hitler's air force, the Luftwaffe. But as the brave pilots of Britain's RAF defended their island nation, there would suddenly be a change in the course of the war in Europe, as Hitler made a surprising decision, turning his attention eastwards to the Soviet Union, instigating an attack on Joseph Stalin, with whom he'd agreed a non-aggression pact at the beginning of the war. Across the icy plains of Russia, the German army discovered that a speedy victory was rather easier said than done. And when Hitler's allies in the Tripartite Pact, Japan, bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Axis faced a new challenge as the United States became embroiled in a war that by 1942 had gone global. As the world was plunged into the chaos of war, it soon became all too clear that Adolf Hitler had seriously miscalculated the strength of his enemies, and with America, Russia and Great Britain now united against him, the Allies were without doubt ready to fight back. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Far East, wherever Hitler and his axes of evil threatened life and liberty, the Allies were ready to take up arms and rise to the challenge. In 1940, those living in occupied Europe were forced to bow to the iron fist of Nazi rule. A police state was formed hot on the heels of the invading army, and while the German generals settled into their new surroundings, private transport was eliminated, newspapers were either pro-German or disappeared altogether, and entire populations learned what it was like to live in fear. More horrifying still, people of the Jewish faith simply vanished from their homes, and many, like the family of young diarist Anne Frank in Amsterdam, were forced into hiding. Soon, concentration camps were created all across Europe, and what had been started to incarcerate Hitler's political opponents as he rose to power in the early 1930s were developed with even more sinister consequences. Hitler's plan for an Aryan master race meant that anyone he considered undesirable had to be eliminated, so, as well as the Jews, communists, homosexuals, the disabled, and those of ethnic origin were rounded up and murdered or imprisoned as the Germans occupied new territories. While countries fell to Hitler's henchmen, governments were taken over as pro-Nazi leaders stepped into office. In France, Henri Pétain was declared the nation's leader and formed a government in Vichy, but very definitely under German control. But while the people of occupied Europe lived in terror, there was just a faint glimmer of hope burning bright, as Hitler had failed to win the Battle of Britain, and the Blitz had only strengthened the resolve of the British to resist Nazi tyranny. By 1941, Britain had weathered the worst of the attacks of the German Air Force and was fighting back. The words of Prime Minister Winston Churchill rang out across the continent as the BBC broadcast the message of V for Victory to the rhythmic strains of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. While people were encouraged to tap the victory rhythm across Europe in defiance of their Nazi captors, politicians, military men and leaders who'd fled to London began to address their nations. Among them was General Charles de Gaulle, who began broadcasting messages to France, encouraging hope and inciting rebellion against Nazi occupation. Although, at this early stage, the growing resistance movements had little hope of pushing the Nazis out of Europe, Hitler was about to make a grave error, as his hatred of the communists, without doubt, clouded his judgment. On June the 22nd, 1941, he gathered together a vast army on the Eastern Front, ready to attack Joseph Stalin's notorious Red Army. By now, Hitler had made alliances with Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, and millions of soldiers began to march onto Soviet soil. It would provoke the greatest land battle in history, and the first few months of the engagement proved extremely successful for the German troops, as they captured major cities and vital territories throughout the Soviet Union and the Balkans. Minsk, Kiev and Odessa all swiftly fell, and soon Hitler ordered an advance on Moscow. However, while the Nazi generals planned their next moves, events on the far side of the globe would, without warning, dangerously rock the balance of power in what had so far been Hitler's war. Unrest in the Far East had led to America's oil embargo on Japan, and Tokyo had started to target the resources of Allied territories in the Pacific. With Japan about to move its army south, Stalin was now free to move Soviet troops from the border with Japanese territory in northeastern China. Soon, highly trained Siberian troops flooded into Moscow and quickly beat back the advancing Germans. By December the 5th, 1941, the German offensive for the city was abandoned, and the Soviets began their counter-offensive. And all the while, the Japanese fleets were stealthily gathering in the Pacific. Then, on December the 7th, the Empire of the Rising Sun not only altered the course of the war, but the course of history as well. In the early hours of the morning, swarms of Japanese planes flew over Pearl Harbor, where the US naval fleet was stationed, bombarding battleships and the nearby airfields. Before the rudely awoken servicemen could even gather their thoughts, the devastation was total. And within 90 minutes, over 2,000 Americans had been killed, as the flames and smoke of burning wrecks darkened the sky. And the Japanese didn't stop there. The very same day, heavy bombardments shattered the peace of Allied territory throughout the Pacific, while on December the 8th, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan. America, the slumbering giant so long on the sidelines adhering to an isolationist policy, was now a major player in the conflict, not only ready to take on the Japanese, but also Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany as well.
All measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us.
The German nation now faced an enemy on a much greater scale than Hitler's supporters had ever imagined. Having signed the Tripartite Pact with Japan and Italy the year before, Hitler was now compelled to honour the agreement. The United States had unlimited resources and a vast population now willing to fight, but Hitler, commanding his army from his wolf's lair in Eastern Europe, was jubilant. With Japan now locked in battle with America, Hitler was convinced that victory would be his, and he resolutely declared war against the United States on December the 11th. It was what the American president not only expected, but also to some degree had hoped for. He could now justify drawing his troops into the European theatre of war and help Winston Churchill and the British in the fight against the Third Reich. Although Roosevelt and Churchill had built up a strong friendship ever since the British Prime Minister had taken the reins of government in 1940, by joining the war against Hitler, the president acquired an unlikely ally in the Russian dictator, Joseph Stalin. It was an extraordinary union, as politically the two men were poles apart, and it was perhaps naive of Roosevelt to trust the Russian. Churchill was rather more cautious, happy to use the might of the Soviets to the Allies' advantage, but always watchful of Stalin's motives. As the war would reach its conclusion, rifts between America and the Soviet Union would begin to widen, but for now, the military powers of the so-called Big Three were united, effectively pushing the chance of victory beyond Hitler's grasp. On the Russian plains, as the battles fought around Moscow failed to go Hitler's way, the Führer began to make increasingly radical decisions, frustrating his men as he doggedly refused to accept defeat. He declared himself commander-in-chief of the army, taking charge of all military strategies, and announced that there would be no retreat from the Russian front near Moscow, and his exasperated generals slowly began to lose faith in their Führer. While the Soviet battles continued, in the Pacific theatre of war, Japan had made impressive inroads in its drive to seize islands and territories rich in resources. Guam, the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong and Singapore had all swiftly fallen to their enemies, and while Japanese troops plundered land as far south as Australian territory in the Solomon Islands, they turned their battleships east towards the tiny coral island of Midway. The Battle of Midway would, however, prove disastrous for Japan, and after 6 months of unchallenged victories, the Japanese suddenly found themselves on the defensive. As American forces flooded into the Pacific, by June 1942, the United States was ready for its first offensive, and the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands began. The US servicemen, unused to the real horrors of war and struggling through the dense disease-ridden jungles, would find it a tough and terrible battle, while 800 miles to the west, Australian soldiers faced an equally harsh struggle. The American General Douglas MacArthur had mobilised Australian troops to protect the strategic point of Port Moresby. He feared Australia's north coast would be at risk of invasion if it fell to the Japanese. It was not the first time they'd tried to take the port, and in May 1942 they'd been defeated in the Battle of Coral Sea. This time, though, the Japanese commanders decided on a different approach, and rather than using their fleets for an amphibious attack, the Imperial soldiers were sent over the treacherous Owen Stanley mountain range. Australian and American divisions marched into action to counter the attack. Battling along the Kokoda Trail, they travelled through dense and dangerous jungles and up towering gorges in one of the most difficult missions of the war. But by the time they completed the trail, those who had survived were too exhausted to fight. Meanwhile, at Milne Bay, on the eastern tip of New Guinea, the Allies were facing another Japanese attack. As more Allied troops were sent to the Pacific Theatre, in the bunkers beneath Whitehall in London, Winston Churchill was looking anxiously at the desolate plains of northern Africa. The celebrated Nazi commander Erwin Rommel, Hitler's Desert Fox, had seized Tobruk in Libya from the Allies. The port was vital in the African campaign, and strategically positioned on the border with Egypt, was dangerously close to the Suez Canal. With this humiliating defeat, combined with the fall of British-held Singapore to the Japanese in February, Churchill feared for the foundations of the British Empire, as well as the free world, and he became increasingly concerned that Cairo would be next. While the British general Bernard Montgomery was sent to Africa to rebuild the fighting spirit of the 8th Army and prepare for a counterattack, Churchill turned to his allies for help. He wanted a major Anglo-American landing in northwest Africa, but was aware that the Soviet leader had been urging for a second front against the Germans since the summer of 1941, while the American president was keen to invade occupied Europe. In August 1942, the British Prime Minister travelled to Moscow to meet Stalin face to face and to justify his strategy. If the Allies could, in his own words, end the year in possession of North Africa, the soft underbelly of Hitler's Europe would be threatened. Strategically then, the Allies would be perfectly placed to invade Italy, and Churchill assured his fellow leader that there would be an eventual invasion of France. Stalin finally agreed and assured Churchill his Soviet troops could hold out against Hitler for the winter. But even as Churchill flew home, German troops, 1 million strong, were just 50 miles from Stalingrad. But this was more than just another battle. Hitler hated the Soviets with a passion, instilling in his commanders and troops the notion that the Russians, as communists, were their inferiors. Winning the city that bore Stalin's name was of great importance to the Nazi leader. However, not surprisingly, the same was equally true for Joseph Stalin. Standing on the Volga River, Stalingrad was vital to the transport route between the Caspian Sea and northern Russia, and its capture would allow the Germans to safely advance into the oil-rich Caucasian region, cutting off fuel supplies to the Soviet army. So while Churchill planned his invasion of North Africa with Roosevelt, Stalin prepared to repel the German Sixth Army from the city that bore his name. Civilians, including women and children, were made to build deep trenches and fortifications outside the city, and Stalin himself ordered that nobody was to leave Stalingrad for fear of demoralizing the Russian troops. Ironically, it would be these same civilians who would suffer the most when the Germans made their first strike. On August the 23rd, 1942, the Luftwaffe hit the city with a huge air bombardment, which exploded into a giant firestorm, killing thousands. Although the Russian planes were greater in number, the Germans dominated the skies, and after weeks of bombing, Stalingrad was reduced to rubble. Then, 3 weeks after the first bombs were dropped, on September the 13th, 1942, the German commander of the Sixth Army, General Paulus, advanced on the city as the Battle of Stalingrad began. It would be one of the most brutal battles of the entire war, as civilians fought alongside the Red Army to defend Stalingrad. By the middle of September, the city itself had become the main battleground, and soldiers fought over individual streets, often locked in hand-to-hand combat, while the Luftwaffe's bombs rained down from the air. After 3 months of carnage, the slow and costly advance by the Sixth Army finally reached the river, capturing 90% of the ruined city and forcing the Soviet forces to split into 2 narrow pockets. Hitler was literally on the verge of a victory that he had only dreamed of. But the freezing winds of the Russian winter began to turn the Volga to ice, and a thick fog enveloped the city. The Luftwaffe could no longer keep up supplies to the troops on the ground, and the tide was already turning. While Hitler could only watch and wait for better weather from his headquarters in the Ukraine, his troops in Africa were faring little better. In the dusty heat of the African desert, General Montgomery and his men were beating back Rommel's forces in the Battle of El Alamein. Although Hitler expected his troops to stand and die for El Alamein, Rommel was not prepared to sacrifice his men, and when defeat was inevitable, he surrendered the town on November the 4th, 1942. The Axis line had been breached, and as Rommel's soldiers retreated to Tunisia, Montgomery's victory was complete. For Churchill, the news was hugely encouraging, and he famously wrote that, "Before Alamein we had no victory, and after it we had no defeats." What's more, the British Prime Minister knew that consolidating on this success was crucial, and the Allied invasion of North Africa was given the green light. Guided by the careful hand of the American general Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allies planned to seize the key ports and airfields of Morocco and Algeria in a simultaneous attack on Casablanca, Oran and Algiers. Then they would advance on Tunisia. The codename for the mission was Operation Torch. With the French dominant in North Africa, there were hopes that Vichy France would cooperate with the Allies, but there were also political complications. Roosevelt had concerns about the reaction of the Vichy French to a British invasion. Only 2 years earlier, after Paris fell, Churchill had destroyed the French fleet at Oran to prevent the ships falling into German hands, and hostilities still lingered between the two nations. The American president decided that it would be best if the British didn't join the fighting until a week after the invasion. Meanwhile, he would win over the Vichy commanders in Algeria by keeping de Gaulle out of the picture and presenting General Henri Giraud as an alternative. Giraud supported Vichy France, but had refused to cooperate with the Germans and had been imprisoned for 2 years by the Nazis. While Roosevelt composed a letter to win the support of Pétain, the leader of Vichy France, in October, America's youngest ever 3-star general, Mark Clark, was smuggled into Algeria by submarine to negotiate with the Vichy commanders in Cherchell. His hope was to persuade them to collaborate with the invasion. It was vital to win their support, as French forces outnumbered those of the British and the Americans considerably. But although senior French commanders were willing to accept Giraud to run the operation, there was a problem with Roosevelt's plan. The commander of all Vichy French forces, second only in rank to Pétain, Admiral Darlan, would by chance be in Algiers on the day of the landings, and Pétain had utterly rejected Roosevelt's request for cooperation. With Clark's negotiations complete, the date set for mobilization was November 8, 1942. The Western Naval Task Force of 102 ships and over 24,000 American troops under the notoriously aggressive General Patton began to make its way across the U-boat-infested waters of the Atlantic. Patton's forces would target Casablanca, while the Central Attack Force of 18,500 American troops were bound for Oran, and the Eastern Task Force of British and American troops under Major General Charles Ryder would invade Algiers. The British General Kenneth Anderson would step in after the landings were complete, while the American Jimmy Doolittle, an ex-stunt pilot, commanded air operations for Patton. Just days after Monty's victory in El Alamein, on the eve of the invasion, Giraud was taken by submarine to Eisenhower's headquarters in Gibraltar, buried deep beneath the base of the rock. Giraud believed he would be commanding the invasion, and there were moments of confusion while Eisenhower explained the mission through his interpreter. Eventually, Giraud agreed to accept a watching brief and be ready to step in later as administrator of French North Africa. In the early hours of November the 8th, the Allied ships approached the African coast, but not all went to plan. A coup to overthrow the pro-Vichy commander in Casablanca had failed, and French defences were now in wait for Patton's task force. The American destroyers and troops were attacked by fierce gunfire, but surviving the onslaught, Patton's men soon secured the beachhead, and within 2 days, US troops were in Casablanca itself. Even so, elsewhere the Central Attack Force struggled with shallow waters, as it attempted to land its ships to the west and east of Oran. After some damage to the landing crafts and a brief skirmish with the French, vehicles and troops were soon driving through the desert heat towards Oran. In Algiers, the resistance had been more successful with their coup than had been the case in Casablanca, and the invading troops were even greeted by some of the French generals. With sweeping victories across Algiers, Oran and Casablanca, Eisenhower stepped into the military limelight and was revered as a highly efficient commander. Nevertheless, while the Allied troops marched further inland towards Tunis, there was still a degree of political confusion that needed to be resolved. On entering Algiers, it had been discovered that the French commander, Admiral Darlan, was in the city on a private visit. With the opportunity to deal with such a senior Vichy representative who had greater authority than Giraud to take command of the French forces, Eisenhower began negotiations with Darlan. The Vichy commander was offered the chance to stay in control of French forces if he joined the Allies. While Giraud waited patiently in Gibraltar, there was outrage amongst the anti-Vichy supporters, and de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, was furious. Keeping the Vichy commander would mean the Vichy regime, with its Nazi laws and concentration camps being maintained, and for many this was simply unacceptable. Also, Hitler and Mussolini were as furious as de Gaulle when they discovered that Darlan was collaborating with the Allies, and they immediately ordered the occupation of Vichy France. Hitler's desert fox, Erwin Rommel, was equally concerned, realising that if the Americans advanced further east, he'd be trapped between them and Montgomery's 8th Army. Fearing an imminent threat to southern Europe, Hitler ordered thousands of troops and Tiger tanks to be sent to North Africa. Undecided about who they should support, Tunisian officials didn't close access to their airfields to either side, and German battalions poured into the country by air and sea, while planes took off from bases in Italy, battering the columns of Allied troops advancing towards Rommel's forces. And then the weather turned against the Allies, as torrential December rains transformed the arid landscape into a quagmire. Instead of reaching Rommel, they had a slow and difficult struggle across the unstable terrain. While sand turned to mud by Christmas Eve, another twist of fate escalated the political confusion in Algeria. An idealistic French student who'd witnessed the Nazi invasion of Paris and supported the Free French shot Darlan at his headquarters. Although the young Frenchman was executed for his actions, it was said that no tears were shed at the funeral of Darlan. The patient Girard finally had his moment of glory, being Darlan's natural successor. The Free French were thrown into turmoil once more, as Girard still supporting the Vichy cause threw all those who'd led the resistance in Algiers into prison. By the Casablanca conference in January, matters were finally clarified a little, and although General de Gaulle had initially refused to attend, Churchill threatened to recognise Girard as the leader of the Free French forces if he didn't. What followed was a rather tense and awkward meeting between the two French generals, but de Gaulle agreed to have Girard as commander-in-chief, and for the time being at least, they would share the joint leadership of the Free French forces. Although Girard maintained the Vichy regime, he was gradually persuaded to take part in the war effort against fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, eventually releasing the prisoners from the concentration camps. However, the confusion amongst the French leaders would eventually result in the loss of their North African empire, as it paved the way for Algerian resistance. As Britain's General Anderson continued to battle through the endless mud and storms, pushing ever onward to reach Rommel, far away in the bitter cold of Stalingrad, matters were fast deteriorating for the Germans fighting within the heart of the city. With the Volga frozen, the Soviets were able to supply their forces more easily, and soon the Russian commander, Marshal Zhukov, had the city surrounded with a vast army of 1 million men. The German 6th Army were trapped, and with no heating fuel or medical supplies, thousands started to die of frostbite, malnutrition and disease. On January 8, 1943, the Russians offered the German general Friedrich Paulus an opportunity to surrender, but Hitler made the commander a field marshal and told him that he must fight to the last bullet. The German soldiers realized that their commander had taken personal glory, sacrificing their welfare in a bitter fight they couldn't win. As more and more ground was lost to the Russian army, Terms of surrender were offered to the Germans once more. Again, Hitler refused to accept defeat. Unlike Rommel, who disobeyed orders to protect his men, Paulus felt he must oblige the Führer, but by this point, resistance was futile. Soviet forces quickly closed in on the defeated Germans, and on February 2nd, over 90,000 survivors were taken captive. They were all that remained of the 220,000 men of the 6th Army. The remainder had either died fighting, from exposure or starvation, and some had even taken their own lives in desperation. And for those who had survived, what they faced at the hands of their captors resulted in only 5,000 of the 90,000 prisoners living through the experience to see their homeland again. Shaken and broken, our people behold the loss of the men of Stalingrad, senselessly and irresponsibly driven to death. These were the words of the White Rose, a group of young German students determined to stand up against Hitler's brutal regime. Support was now faltering for the Nazi cause. Stalingrad was the Nazis' biggest defeat, and without doubt it dealt a huge psychological blow to German morale. Resistance to Hitler and his henchmen began to escalate, and the Führer's mental and physical states also began to deteriorate. Some have suggested that Hitler was showing the early symptoms of Parkinson's disease, most notably in his handwriting and speech, which caused the Führer to withdraw from the public gaze. But while Hitler furiously refused to accept the defeat of Stalingrad, resistance to German occupation was growing all over Europe. One of his generals had been assassinated in Prague, while partisans in Yugoslavia had become united under the leadership of the anti-fascist Tito, and resistance movements throughout France were joining together to become part of the Free French forces of de Gaulle. As the Europeans battled against Hitler and Mussolini, the Japanese were beginning to feel the strain of the war with America in the Far East. On February the 9th, 1943, US troops finally claimed their victory in Guadalcanal after months of fighting, and Japan's casualties were huge. Two months later, they were dealt another devastating blow when they lost their great Admiral Yamamoto, who'd masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor. Allied forces had hunted him down, and as he flew over the Solomon Islands, his plane was bombarded with heavy gunfire before he crashed to his death in the jungle below. The Imperial Army were now rapidly losing ground, as General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz masterminded invasions across the islands of the Pacific, moving ever closer to Japan. But with every soldier driven by a sense of duty to the Japanese Emperor, there was never going to be room for complacency. In Africa, Patton had faced his first battle with the Germans, and casualties had been high. With little combat experience, the troops fresh from the US were not as prepared as Montgomery's men, but when they eventually converged with the British, progress was quickly made. The final drive to take Tunisia began on the 19th of April, and by the 7th of May the capital Tunis had been wrestled from Hitler's control. 6 days later, the last Axis resistance in Africa ended as 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken captive. Eisenhower now celebrated the great triumph alongside Giraud, as troops paraded and planes swooped above them in a show of victory. But as jubilation filled the air, Eisenhower knew that he still had a long battle ahead of him. At the Casablanca Conference, following the success of Operation Torch, the Allies had agreed that Sicily would be the next target after securing North Africa. By removing the Axis naval and air forces from this strategically positioned island, it would allow freedom of movement for the Allied shipping in the Mediterranean Sea. Equally, it would also put pressure on Mussolini's regime and hopefully take Italy out of the war. The position of the fascist leader was becoming increasingly tenuous by the summer of 1943. The Allies had defeated the Axis in the Tunisia campaign, and there were Italian troops struggling alongside German forces on the Eastern Front. The people of Italy were also suffering as Allied bombings were taking their toll, and there was a chronic shortage of food. With no raw materials factories ground to a virtual standstill, and there was even industrial strikes in the north. There was also a growing distrust of the propaganda the Italians were being fed by Mussolini's fascist regime. While the streets were filled with demonstrators and the people battled through the harsh conditions that they believed were as a result of fascism, Mussolini was beginning to realise that his alliance with Hitler had not brought Italy the glory he'd hoped for. The Allies began preparation for the invasion by first attacking the tiny island of Pantelleria, which lay between Tunisia and Sicily. It was something of a thorn in Churchill's side, as Axis forces based there interfered with British air and sea traffic in the Mediterranean. Throughout May and June, over 6,000 tons of explosives pounded the island, making sure that the invasion force would have little resistance when landing. After the island shuddered beneath a relentless bombardment, on June the 10th, the Allies finally saw a white cross on one of the airfields. It was the first time in history that an enemy land force was compelled to surrender in the absence of an accompanying ground invasion. Waves of Allied soldiers quickly hit the beaches, and although little remained of the island, it now paved the way for Eisenhower's next step in the invasion of Italy. While the troops prepared for the attack on Sicily, the Germans were expecting an attack on a completely different island. The Allies had planted documents on a dead body off the coast of Spain, dressed as a British officer, containing false information concerning an attack on Sardinia. When the details were passed on to Nazi generals, they were convinced that the documents were genuine and began to build up defences on the wrong island. Finally, Operation Husky, as the invasion of Sicily was codenamed, began on the night of July the 9th and continued on the 10th. There were howling winds, which made the landings treacherous and forced many aircraft widely off course. But the weather made the invasion all the more unexpected, and as troops broke out from the beaches, they took patrols by surprise all along the coastline. Despite the Italians and Germans stationed on Sicily trying their best to halt the invasion, the Allies swiftly seized the historic town of Syracuse on the first day, and in less than 2 weeks they were in the capital, Palermo. The British and Americans soon discovered that there was little opposition from the Italian civilians as the tanks rolled through their cities. In fact, many were overjoyed at their arrival. Within a week, Montgomery's British 8th Army had secured the Campania region on the eastern coast of Sicily. Reaching the simmering crater of Mount Etna, the British divided the two columns, pushing further north on either side of the volcano. Montgomery would surprise not only the enemy, but also Patton's troops moving in from the west. Patton, not renowned for his patience, was furious as the British general cut off the American advance. The battle swiftly turned into a fight between Patton and the British, described by the American general as a horse race in which the prestige of the US Army is at stake. In the end, Patton did win his race against Montgomery, reaching Messina first, but literally only a matter of hours after, the Italian and German forces had quietly made their escape from the island, evacuating entirely to mainland Italy. As Sicily fell, the effect on the Italians was dramatic, as it was now clear that the Allies would use the island as a base for invading their nation. Consequently, Mussolini was overthrown, and an armistice was agreed between the Allies and the Italians, and the fascist dictator was imprisoned. To the relief of the military and civilian population, Eisenhower announced that bombing raids on Italy would now cease. Nevertheless, Hitler was not prepared to leave matters there, and was soon planning to take his revenge on the Italians for betraying the Tripartite Pact. Troops were ordered from Russia into Italy, and as the Luftwaffe bombarded the Italian ships escaping to Malta, German troops marched into Rome. Mussolini was rescued from his prison and installed by Hitler as a puppet leader in the north of the country. So although the Allies could celebrate the success of the landings on Sicily, they were now divided about undertaking a major campaign on the Italian mainland. Roosevelt was still waiting for the opportunity to launch a French invasion, yet he was tempted by the ease with which Sicily had fallen, not to mention the air bases of southern Italy that would allow the Allies to conduct bombing raids on Germany. The port of Naples was also a prize worth grasping and was within the range of air cover, and the Americans, although hesitant, agreed to proceed. The mission was codenamed Operation Baytown, and Montgomery quickly prepared his troops in Messina on Sicily for an invasion of the mainland. The tip of Calabria, the toe of Italy, was so close to the Sicilian port that landing craft could be launched directly from there rather than from carriers at sea. On the 3rd of September, Montgomery's 8th Army crossed the Messina Strait and landed on the beaches of Calabria unopposed. With the African campaign lost, Rommel had now been redeployed as commander of operations in northern Italy, while General Kesselring was entrusted with Rome and all territory south of the capital. As the tension built, troops from Britain and America made their way from North Africa to Salerno, just 35 miles south of Naples. On September the 9th, the main attack force, led by General Lieutenant Mark Clark, arrived in the early hours of the morning.
All hands, man your battle stations! Man your battle stations!
They were met with resistance and began battling on the Italian shores. However, while the Allies struggled on the beaches of Salerno, the people of Naples rose up against their German oppressors. 3 days of brutal fighting ensued, with terrible reprisals from the Nazis. and when the Allies reached the ancient city, they were met with a scene of utter devastation. Kesselring had ordered that all communications, transportation, water and power grids be destroyed. Buildings had been mined or burnt to the ground, bridges had been bombed, and railroad tracks ripped out, while the harbour was a mass of sunken ships. To the credit of the Allies, and despite intense German air raids, the port of Naples was reopened to traffic within a week of its capture. However, much rebuilding remained to be done, and nearly 800,000 Neapolitans depended upon the Allies for their basic survival for many months. As Allied soldiers helped the inhabitants restore their city, once Naples was secure, it was time for the troops to head north. By mid-October, battle lines had been drawn along the Volturno and Trigno rivers. The Volturno itself was a great challenge, varying in width from 150 to 200 feet, and the riverbanks were literally bursting as the water reached depths of 15 feet. The Allies soon discovered that the terrain would be their greatest enemy as they struggled to build pontoon bridges over the winding Volturno, battling through the fierce autumn winds and pounding rain. One exasperated US soldier exclaimed that every river in this crazy country seems to be called Volturno. There was increasing concern that the Italian campaign would not match up with the swift victory of the Sicilian invasion. The struggle between the Allies and Nazi troops on the mainland continued as a war of attrition was fought, with the glittering prize of Rome slipping further away as every day passed. The month-long struggle by the Allies as they advanced from the Volturno River to the Bernhard Line brought both the 5th and 8th Armies near the point of exhaustion. Meanwhile, in Russia, Stalin was pushing the Nazis further south and was at the door of the Balkans. Winston Churchill, although happy with the progress of the Allies in Africa, Russia and out in the Pacific, was disappointed they were not in a position to deploy more troops in Italy. But for the Big Three, Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill, there were more pressing matters to be discussed. While forces continued to battle on the Italian mainland, the Allied leaders met in Tehran on November 28, 1943, to discuss how they would end the war. Stalin still supported an Anglo-American invasion of France, and Roosevelt had the advantage when presenting Churchill once more with the prospect of the Normandy landings. Churchill was reluctant to release British troops for Italy, still pushing towards Rome, but he agreed to the invasion of France, promising that troops would arrive in Western Europe by the spring of 1944. As soon as Italy's capital fell to the Allies, Churchill would deploy all available forces for the invasion of France. While the casualties in Italy mounted as the Allied troops pushed slowly further north, in December, Eisenhower left the Italian front for a family gathering in America. While in Massachusetts, he was told by his superiors he'd not be returning to Italy. Disappointed he couldn't say goodbye to all his loyal lieutenants in person, Eisenhower made his way to London, where he took up the position of Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. The outcome of the war depended on the ambitious invasion he was charged with overseeing, and Eisenhower was not the only commander to leave his troops in Italy, because just 2 days after Christmas, Montgomery was also called back to Britain to work on preparations for D-Day. With the new year of 1944 came better news for the Allies. In Russia, the siege of Leningrad was over, and German troops were surrendering across the continent from the Crimea to Italy. The resistance to Nazi occupation was finally breaking the steel grip of the Third Reich, and as Eisenhower collaborated with the British, Hitler faced his greatest challenge yet. As the Allies finally entered Rome on June the 5th, the ancient capital that had once been the beating heart of the Roman Empire celebrated the fall of Hitler's empire. The Allies were now poised to launch the most daring amphibious landings in history, as hundreds of thousands of British, Commonwealth and American troops made their way to the coast of Normandy. France was just a breath away from liberation, and the battle for victory had begun.